This is Stranger Than Fiction with Daniel Caine. This episode tackles the controversial subjects of consciousness and precognition. Vertigo hit. My awareness had suddenly been pushed to the brink of some hidden precipice of consciousness, and teetering on that invisible edge, I could do nothing but surrender to the forces of the gravity I'd been free of. The earthward plunge began. I felt minuscule, a minute particle plummeting through a night sky generated from dreamlike visions. The descent seemed endless, and the rarefied air of the vast upper atmosphere had my lungs straining to inflate. Far below loomed a pure black sea, surrounded by a thin blue rim and a white cornea that curved away to form the distant horizon of the world to which I fell, and I could do nothing but plummet towards it through the airless surround. The asphyxia broke. I could at last suck hard on oxygen from the now rushing air, and instantly felt myself accelerate downwards again to a phenomenal speed. All around me, the horizon was becoming lost in that rapidly approaching expanse of blackness, and I braced for collision. Impact. But I felt nothing. I pierced through the surface of my own pupil with ease, and the drag of the still body of water beneath stripped me instantly of all momentum. Motionless. Suspended in an amniotic silence, a silence punctuated only by the distant, rhythmic beating sound of my own heart. That was an excerpt taken from my book, Matter of Time, but the passage is actually a fictionalized version describing the exact experience I myself had in a near-death event I suffered that is stranger than any fiction I could have written. That nocturnal dream ended as I pierced the pupil of my left eye, but it was a voice saying something to me that woke me on what should have been a midweek morning off work like any other. Still in a dazed state, I immediately headed for the phone in the kitchen and called the doctor's office to make an urgent appointment for 9:30 a.m. My wife, knowing that I avoid doctors, was concerned enough to ask me what was the matter, and in response I simply said, "I've got an aneurysm. It's here." I pinpointed the exact location inside my skull, with my right forefinger pointing at my left pupil and my other forefinger hovering at my left temple. It was only then that the words I had just uttered surfaced fully into my awareness, along with the echoes of those words spoken by that voice in my sleep. But a shockwave of nausea hit at what I was facing. I was completely healthy and had no symptoms, yet 90 minutes later I was telling barefaced lies to a doctor about tingling sensations and slurred speech just to convince the man to send me immediately for the brain scans I knew that I needed. And by 11:30 a.m., I was sitting shell-shocked in a neurosurgeon's office as he confirmed the life-threatening aneurysm and its location by picking up 2 biros from his desk and saying, "The aneurysm is here." One of the biros pointed at my left pupil, and the other hovered at my left temple. It was a surgeon now holding the exact same pose as I had held in pinpointing the undetectable lesion only hours before. And it was the surgeon now uttering the exact same words that the voice had whispered to me in coming out of that dream state. A precognition. But it had not prepared me for the death sentence that the neurosurgeon then pronounced on me. The lesion on my internal carotid artery was alarming in size and situated underneath my brain. Just attempting to gain surgical access would likely kill me, and if I did survive the surgery, the procedure threatened to wipe the word processing centers of my brain, leaving me as a prisoner inside a brain that could no longer describe any object or person in the world I perceived. A fate worse than death for an author. I just had to escape and run away, but the surgeon headed me off. He threw a pad of death certificates onto his desk and said, "I'll fill it in now, with today's date. I just won't put in the exact time today you'll die." Thankfully, I made it through. But the surgeon had made it quite clear that I had been slated for certain death that day, destined for my life to end in an instant, as I reached for a cup or as my lips formed my next word mid-speech. A fate averted, by that precognition. Some aspect of consciousness had reached out across space and time to a future moment to gain some vital information and deliver it back to the present. So, precognition is time travel through consciousness, and that life-saving encounter with consciousness and all its possibilities is undoubtedly what first inspired my book, Matter of Time. But it wasn't the main inspiration. What it did inspire was a personal journey of investigation into the subject of consciousness to find my own answers. Because the first thing I learned on my journey is that scientists can't even adequately define consciousness and cannot agree on what or where it is. And that has resulted in two opposing views. The majority view of science is that consciousness is a mere byproduct of neural network activity that has evolved. So, without living neural tissue, consciousness ceases to exist. Whereas the minority view of science, more aligned with Eastern philosophy, suggests that consciousness, as an entity, suffuses the entire cosmos and is the creator of our realities and the creator of our neural networks. In other words, consciousness exists without living neural tissue. So, in deciding between the two viewpoints, it just seemed obvious to see if I could seek out evidence of expressions of consciousness after death, simply because the deceased possess no neural activity that could account for consciousness as a byproduct, as described by the majority view of science. And the precognition that had saved my life at the moment of death was one of those expressions of consciousness that I was searching for. But I could think of no other way of seeking evidence of consciousness after death, except for investigating seances and mediums. And so began a 3 to 4 year investigation of the very subjects that science would shy away from. And I did find some answers, which were startling, confronting, and certainly stranger than fiction. The first seance I attended was different than I imagined. There were around 25 to 30 chairs arranged in a tight circle in an otherwise empty room, and the lights were dimmed with enough ambient light that the silhouettes of everyone seated could be seen around the circle, and we were instructed to hold hands. It was then a matter of waiting in silence for something to happen. And the first thing to catch my attention was a pool of light that appeared on the floor in front of me. It lasted for a few seconds before disappearing, and my first thought was where some projector could be hidden. I'd taken a good look around the room when I'd entered, but had seen nothing suspicious. Then, my world was to change. Suddenly, out of mid-air burgeoned a three-dimensional translucent spectre of light in the form of a man's head and neck. It hovered in front of my face, leaving me senseless and physically paralyzed. He was an obviously powerful man with strong features, tan skin, and long black hair swept back, and he wore 2 braids decorated with beads. I was looking at an indigenous American, but was still too senseless and paralyzed to register the ridiculousness of what I was seeing. It was then that the man's face drifted even closer to me, and looking directly into my eyes, he spoke with such passion that it bordered on vitriol. The force of the repeating words pinned me even harder to my chair. I am still here. I am still here. I am still here. Then the spectre simply disappeared. It was only then that my physical and mental paralysis ended, and I had just enough time to convince myself that I had imagined it all in the half-light, when the man sitting next to me whispered, "Whoa, he didn't seem happy with you," and everyone else sitting around me muttered their agreement. That séance was a sobering experience, but despite the events being witnessed by others, it proved little for the purposes of my investigation into consciousness. And as it turned out, I didn't have to wait long for that proof. The séance I attended was held in the UK, and I returned home to Australia shortly afterwards and was constantly trying to rationalise how the charlatanism had been perpetrated. But on sharing the events with a number of people, one lady was to respond in a totally unexpected way. She told me that she recognised the man I had seen and asked me when the séance had been held. It turns out that a friend of hers, an Indigenous American civil rights activist, had died 24 hours before the séance. The man's name was Russell Means, and I was further informed that his speeches, that he'd given even to the US Senate, often ended with the words, "We are still here," in describing the plight of Indigenous Americans. But when talking of his life in more personal moments, he would often say that the government have tried to silence me with imprisonment, but I am still here. I was stabbed in prison in an attempted murder, but I am still here. And there have been many assassination attempts aimed at me, but I am still here. I am still here. I am still here. Incredibly, only weeks after the séance, I was provided with the punchline of proof that I had been seeking. A man had died in the United States, and some expression of his consciousness had reached out to provide a message to a stranger in the UK, who could then pass on that message to a grieving friend in Australia. However, it is important to say that this does not prove a life after death or the existence of a spirit world, though they could exist. We just don't know. But what it does prove is two things. Firstly, consciousness can reach out across space and time. And secondly, consciousness can create physical manifestations in space and time, both of which would seem to move the needle of opinion towards that minority view of science and away from the majority view. But there is another possibility about the nature of consciousness, because both of those scientific views might not be entirely incorrect. Scientific research is trying to observe consciousness indirectly from an outside objective point of view, when the only way to view it is by diving deeply inside of it, or, as in my case, by being pushed off that invisible precipice and plunging into it. And while Matter of Time is a science fiction crime thriller with supernatural and horror undertones, it does offer an insight into the nature of consciousness, because many of the more fantastical storylines are actually based in true life experiences that are stranger than the fiction being portrayed. In the next episode, we will explore this further.
You've been listening to Stranger Than Fiction with Daniel Caine. Join us in the next episode as we continue to investigate why the reality we perceive truly is stranger than fiction. For more information, visit www.danielcaine.com.